I want to welcome you, and we'll have our speaker in just a moment, but I want to tell you about the next lectures that are coming up and a new set of programs we have we call Behind the Scenes, where we're taking you to sites or actually talking to historians about how they do things. And one of the things we're going to be looking at is June 13th, coming up soon, is going to Ivy Hill Cemetery. You don't need to go for negative reasons or sad reasons, but to hear one of our board members and former board members talk about how remote sensing, ground penetrating radar is done, actually see it being done, and to find graves in order to help understand in actually operating cemeteries today where people should not be buried because there's not a gravestone for everyone who has been buried in America, if you hadn't figured that one out. July 13th, several of us will be giving a walking tour of the U.S. Colored Troops. We'll be going to Freedom House on Duke Street, where Louisville Hospital was, and then going on to Alexandria National Cemetery. August 8th, we're going to be having a Zoom regarding photographic history, and November 11th, basics of oral history from the city's oral historian. And the lectures coming up will be in Wednesday, September 25th. Madeline Lee Bendel House will be talking about Civil War prisons. October 23rd, McCargo Law will be talking about research on George Mason's slaves, which I live pretty much right next door to that. So, and then earlier, just next month, Catherine Weintraub will be talking about Friendship Firehouse celebrating its 250th anniversary and the history of the Alexandria Fire Department. We'll also have our annual meeting, which takes about 5 or 10 minutes, so I hope you'll still come and elect our new board. So I'd like to welcome tonight Nicholas Redding. Thank you for coming that long way from Maryland, but I understand it took you longer to come from Union Street to the Lyceum than it took you to come from Maryland to Virginia. So those are a hard 6 blocks to go. Nicholas Redding comes from Preservation Maryland, and he's speaking to us tonight about, and he's in charge of oversees the operations programs and growing professional staff of Preservation Maryland, including the creation of a dynamic new program called Smart Growth Maryland. Additionally, he's worked in partnership with the National Park Service Historic Preservation Training Center to establish what is called the Campaign for Historic Trades, a new program dedicated to developing the next generation of traditional tradespeople. He also serves as the vice chair of the National Preservation Partners Network, which is a national network of statewide and local preservation organizations. Previously, he chaired the Maryland Partners for Open Space, the statewide open space advocacy coalition, and was the vice chair of the Frederick County Historic Preservation Commission. Prior to arriving at Preservation Maryland, he also served in leadership positions at several heritage and preservation organizations, including being the executive director of the Long Branch Plantation, which is a 19th century historic site in the Shenandoah Valley. He's also been deputy director of an advocacy at the Civil War Trust in DC and led a national coalition to prevent the construction of a casino on the iconic Gettysburg battlefield. I remember that. Thank you. Thank you. Prior to the trust, he served as a park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park, so no wonder you knew about and wanted to protect it, and the C&O Canal National Historic Park. Tonight's topic is the work of Preservation Maryland to save key resources, invest in historic trades, and promote livable and affordable communities. And thank you very much for coming over, and we really welcome your perspective. Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for that introduction. It's It's a little alarming to try and give a lecture, not only on a stage that has been a lecture hall since the 1830s, but flanked by Cicero and Seneca. So I hope I live up to the Stoic ideal tonight. You know, it's interesting. You know, coming from Maryland and seeing all the traffic coming from Maryland, and then seeing all the traffic here tonight, we have tremendous challenges, not just in the arena of traffic, but all of our communities have challenges. And what I want to talk about tonight, and sort of mix and match the story here, is not only the work of Preservation Maryland, but where I see preservation fitting in to the landscape of where this country is right now, and how it can help to address some of the most pressing challenges that this country faces. Because you can't look at preservation or any of these issues really in a vacuum. They all interact with each other. And if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we have to figure out ways to use preservation to address some of the biggest challenges, again, that this country is facing. And I will argue, and hopefully by the end you'll agree with me, that preservation holds a lot of promise and opportunity, not only for Alexandria, not only for Virginia, not only for Maryland, but for our entire country and perhaps even our world. Let's see. What was working before? Oh, there we go. So, we've got partisan discord. We are in the middle of an election season. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Oh, you guys are too. We have a changing climate. We have failing infrastructure, overcrowded schools. We have transportation challenges. Some of you may have sat in it. We are in the middle of a divided America. And so some may ask, maybe not in this room, but others might ask, why now, in the face of all of this, and these seemingly insurmountable challenges, should the pursuit of preserving history still matter? How could we possibly prioritize the past when the future seems so uncertain at this moment and when we're so profoundly divided? Because I would argue that the study of history and the pursuit of preservation is perhaps the last best hope for America. First and foremost, it's important to remember that every challenge confronting us has its roots in history. Everything has a history. So you might wonder why we have this delightful candy up here, but I recently was trying to make this point to my 7-year-old daughter that everything has a history. And I told her this when she bit into a piece of candy corn, and it just sort of dawned on me at that moment that even, yes, this delicious or terrible, depending on your perspective. Show of hands, terrible? Terrible. Wonderful? All right, wow, okay, cool. Even it has a piece, even that piece of candy is rooted in history. And the candy corn, in case you were curious, was originally sold under the name of chicken feed and was invented in the late 1880s in Philadelphia. But back to the real issue, which is building a brighter, more just, united, and sustainable future for this country. I always come back to the words of Stephen Ambrose, who wrote that the past is a source of knowledge and the future is a source of hope. Love of the past, therefore, implies faith in the future. And so, for those of us to whom the past is forever speaking, we can appreciate this optimistic view of history. And not because we wear rose-colored glasses or we somehow see a more romantic view of the past, but instead because we understand the reality of history and we can see patterns played out across the generations. We can see hardscrabble survivors who carved out a home in the wilderness. We can see native peoples who held desperately to their traditions in the face of a heartless government. We can see founders who risked their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor in planting that flag of liberty some 250 years ago. We can see the enslaved who risked their all to escape the villainous inhumanity of human bondage. That's temerity, that's audacity, that's history. But strong lessons heroes to appreciate, mistakes to study, and pitfalls to avoid, that is preaching to the choir here of those assembled, and it's not enough anymore simply to talk about history. We need to use history, historic places, and the physical act of preservation to take action. And in doing so, demonstrate the power of our work. And that's where we come back to time and time again at Preservation Maryland in our work is it's not enough for a historic building to exist. It's not enough to save a historic building. It has to have a job. It has to have a purpose. And we have to explain the relevance of our work every day. So take, for example, the climate challenges we face. Regardless of where you stand on the issue, building a more sustainable and environmentally friendly economy benefits us all, and finding ways to avoid burning fossil fuels only makes the air cleaner and our lungs healthier. But why should preservationists care about this, or how can we engage in this? Because the stat you see right here. Buildings alone generate some 40% of annual global carbon emissions. And building construction accounts for another 11%. So together, over half of all carbon emissions are tied to buildings. If we don't include buildings in the calculus of climate, then we will never solve our climate issues. Preservation, I love to tease our environmental community and our environmental friends in Maryland, is the original green movement. We are the original smart growth, we are the original environmentalists because we are recycling buildings. Reusing, recycling, restoring, and making our buildings more efficient could have a tremendous impact on the climate. It could save history, it could make our lives better in the process. Because not only is there all of this emissions coming from buildings and constructing buildings and the industry of buildings, but embodied in our already built environment is carbon. It took carbon to build these structures, and so baked into them, into the physical structure of a building, is carbon. Leave it there and reuse it, and we're ahead. Knock it over, throw it in the landfill, and build new, and we're generating more waste, more carbon, and more problems. If you care about trash, you should also care about preservation, because on average, 23% of our nation's waste is construction waste. And this number is startling, and I had to look it up because sometimes you get numbers so big and you're like, what does that mean? So in 2018, 567 million tons of America's waste was generated from demolitions alone. So what is that? Well, that's the equivalent of throwing out 1,553 Empire State Buildings annually. Just knocking it over and throwing it out. We're talking about millions of tons of construction waste going out every year. But by comparison, something you hear about often, which is plastic, which I'm not going to make a compelling argument for more disposable plastic, but I want to give you a sense of the scale and the context. That equates to roughly 35 million tons of single-use plastic being thrown away. And, we pass laws about making sure we reduce the amount of plastic that we're throwing away, but we are okay with throwing out so many buildings. Demolishing historic structures is literally smothering us with trash and vastly adding to these problems. That in turn makes trash pickup cost more. We see this all the time in Maryland of adding fees for more costs associated with trash pickup, trying to find places to put the trash. Sometimes we burn the trash, sometimes we cart it off and, we send it to New Jersey or something. Sorry, is there anybody from New Jersey out there? I don't know. It just seems like a place that would take trash. That's awful. That was it. You wrote that joke. That was terrible. It confounds our problem. It just confounds the problem of trash in general. Another study in Maryland looks at the comparison, making a comparison between new build versus reuse. And it looked at the economic impact of rehabilitation. And it looks specifically at the economic impact, and you're actually looking at two sides of the same coin, of rehabilitating a 50,000 square foot historic industrial building versus constructing a new building on the outskirts of the city. So constructing a new 50,000 square foot building on the outskirts. And that study found that the rehab historic building, in comparison to a new structure, resulted in this. Oh, this is a good one. I didn't even know that we were going to have such bad traffic. A reduction in vehicle miles traveled by upwards of 40%. So again, this is comparison of a new build versus rehabbing. So this is the benefit of rehabbing. Reducing travel in CO2 by 123 metric tons. And you can read it here, retaining the embodied energy. There's that embodied carbon. Preserving over 5.5 acres of open space. Reducing 2,500 tons going to the landfill. $100,000 in natural resources, and a savings, and these are numbers, these are probably almost like 8 or 10-year-old numbers at this, 8 or 10-year-old numbers at this point. Almost $1 million of infrastructure investment reduced. So reusing, recycling, restoring, and reinvesting rather in historic places is one of the strongest tools we have for the environment and puts preservation at the center of the solution. And that the greenest building is the one already standing has been quoted and said many times, but it's still true. But preservation isn't only able to help us turn the tide on a warming globe, it can also help us bridge partisan divides and give people meaningful careers in the process. So at Preservation Maryland, we're very proud, you heard in the introduction, that we're the home to the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is a partnership with the National Park Service that is focused on helping to train recent veterans and young adults in historic trades. And from repairing monuments to restoring buildings, these young adults and recent vets are involved in all of that work. And we are also focused on helping to eliminate the systemic barriers that have strangled this field for decades. And as a result of that focus on this work, we've registered first of their kind apprenticeships with not only the state of Maryland, but also with the U.S. Department of Labor to clear the pathway for training in these trades. We've actually never had registered apprenticeships for many of our historic trades. And what we are focused on now is making sure that we have apprenticeships that match the need. So we have registered apprenticeships for historic window technicians, for preservation carpentry, and for deconstruction. So if a building does have to come down, how do we bring it down in such a way that can be reused and not end up in a landfill? And we also conducted a national study that looked at the need for these workers, because oftentimes the question then is, yeah, but isn't that kind of niche? How many people are really engaged in this? And that was necessary because as a nation, you may hear this sometimes when the economic reports come out. We track a host of different trade skills, and we track a host of different ways of looking at the construction industry. But we always focus on new builds. So you hear about housing starts, you don't hear about housing rehabs. So we needed new economic numbers to back all this up. So some of the big findings that I would draw your attention to is that building rehab employs over 1.3 million workers annually. Which equates to about 19% of the building construction industry. $85 billion. And there's some 96 million buildings in the United States. Of those, 40% are over 50 years old. And another 13.3 will reach that 50-year mark over the next decade. So this is a massive issue, and we need to have the trained hands able to do this work. When you look at all of just the historic districts that are actually defined as historic districts, you're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood, somewhere between 4 and 6 million. And we are going to need, by 2020, another 10,000 jobs in historic trades need to be filled every year between now and 2030, rather. some 100,000 trades workers, preferably with historic trades experience, and another 69,000 workers associated with that. So it not only improves work quality, but it also makes it simpler to enter these careers. And obviously, investment in this is going to be immense, $45 billion worth of investment in historic buildings by 2030. But one of the problems that we have is that we can't build our way out of every problem. And sometimes we have to fix what we've already built. And we always focus in the other direction. We focus on housing starts, not housing rehabs. And perhaps it's tied up in this pithy little quote from Kurt Vonnegut that a flaw in the human character is that everybody wants to build and nobody wants to do maintenance. We see that everywhere, right? We build new roads, but it's not as much fun to dedicate maintenance. You know, there's no ribbon cutting because you maintain the road. There's ribbon cutting when you build the new one, though. And so we can create jobs, we can create meaningful jobs that will help build a more prosperous nation, create pathways to meaningful careers, careers that on average pay more in the historic trades than they do in the general trades. But you might ask, how does that help us bridge divides? Because I said perhaps we can use these to help us bridge partisan divides too. Because baked into this style of trades training in which we're engaged is public service. Many of these trainees serve under an AmeriCorps model, and they're placed around the nation. They leave home, they meet new people, they experience new history, and they build compassion and empathy that can only come from travel. And this is so critical because we suffer from a crisis of bubbles. 1 in 3 Americans are now almost completely isolated from members of the opposite political party. And so we're sorted out into our neighborhoods by demographics, race, creed, religion, experience. And by the time we reach adulthood, many of us will have only worked alongside people who we look, sound, and believe like us. And that's why public service desperately matters, and why we're so excited that our governor, Governor Moore, here in, well, I would say here in Maryland, not Maryland, but back over in Maryland, is so dedicated to public service and created one of the first agencies dedicated to public service. It desperately matters because it takes people and it gives them an opportunity to see varied, diverse parts of the country or parts of Maryland. It breaks down misconceptions and it builds understanding. And in the process, we're restoring places and building careers. It is exactly what we need at this moment. And that's also backed up because an organization called Moore & Cowman found that we suffer more from what we call a perception gap than an actual gap in understanding. Polling from back in 2022 showed that across the political spectrum, there's broad agreement on the telling of history. But buzzwords and political bubbles often obscure that fact. So you're looking here at polling done of both Republicans and Democrats, and using slightly different ways of explaining it, we find that there is vast agreement. 95% of Democrats and 93% of Republicans agree that Americans have a responsibility to learn from our past and fix our mistakes. That's the ask of Republicans. And Democrats, throughout our history, Americans have made incredible achievements and ugly errors. And then if you look at the rest of this report, you find that the perception is that the other side doesn't believe in those things. And so meeting people across the aisle, bridging these divides through public service, is not just a nice thing to have, it's critical, and historic preservation can play a really compelling role in that. But surely we can't fix overcrowded schools and a lack of capital necessary to address them. But the answer is, in fact, of course we can. So row home rehabs in Maryland and all across the country, from New Jersey to Virginia and beyond, are being catalyzed by preservation. In Maryland, like many states, we pay for our schools through local property taxes. And in places like Baltimore City, with nearly 16,000 vacant, mostly older historic homes, the potential for local tax revenue is greatly depressed by low or even non-existent property values. And while the plight of vast stretches of abandoned row homes may seem hopeless, it's not. Because right at this very moment, dozens of historic row homes are being restored near the Hohenlithograph building in East Baltimore. And what catalyzed that renewal that you're seeing here? Historic preservation. Fueled by the federal and state historic tax credit, the Hohenlithograph building, which was once the vast seat of lithography, is now a community hub with workforce training, community spaces, and a space for Morgan State University, one of our HBCUs, to grow. And what was once a derelict structure and a drain on resources is now once again paying taxes, and by extension, it's supporting better schools. On average, in most historic tax credit projects, the increase in value is roughly equal to 25%, which is no small matter when it comes to these large catalytic type projects that cost tens of millions of dollars to accomplish. But even these smaller projects, when linked together, incrementally support our schools, our roads and services, and the safety net we've come to depend on. And going back a little bit in this conversation to the economic number about the cost savings in infrastructure, not only are you saving money in infrastructure because you don't have to build a pipeline out to it, you don't have to build sewer out to it, it's already connected to those things. But you're also increasing the property values and therefore increasing the taxes paid on that structure. Economically, this story here, though, barely scratches the surface of the benefits of preservation. Place Economics, which is a firm that studies historic communities around the nation, has compiled sort of a laundry list of positive economic indicators associated with historic communities and places. And these are three of my favorites that I think are important for all of us to know, which is, first and foremost, jobs grow faster in historic communities. So in Nashville, for example, only 3% of jobs are in historic districts, but they account for 11% of all job growth. So our most resilient restaurants, which is a particularly hard-hit sector as a result of the pandemic, are also predominantly located in historic districts, places with the most atmosphere and the most authentic ambience. Now, we see this time and time again in communities, and if you think about it, some of your longest lasting restaurants are those that are located in historic districts, and the ones that are a revolving door are in new build construction. Heritage tourists spend more and stay longer than any other category of tourists. In New York City, for example, 4 out of 10 overnight visitors rank visiting historic sites as their primary interest, which in turn pumps almost $8 billion into the economy there, just from heritage tourism. But, you know, that you can say, well, that's New York City. In Pittsburgh, for example, nearly half of all visitors rank heritage tourism as their primary interest. And in turn, Pittsburgh sees some $64 million per year in additional economic activity based purely on the additional amount heritage tourists spend each day compared to other tourists. And they call this the heritage premium, sort of the dividend that historic preservation and preserved communities bring. And the jobs of the future are also attracted to historic communities. Firms employing knowledge workers are particularly attracted to historic areas. Although historic districts are home to just 31% of all jobs in Savannah, they're home to 39% of professional, scientific, and technical services jobs, 57% of their art, entertainment, and recreation jobs, and 74% of their educational services jobs. The same story, again, back to Pittsburgh, is the same, where historic districts contain slightly more than 37% of all jobs, but they have 47% of the jobs in finance, 58% of the jobs in education, and 44% of the jobs in information. The knowledge workers, and by extension, the jobs and workers of the future of the American economy, are concentrated right now in historic districts. And so from the environment to jobs, to the economy, to schools, to infrastructure, preservation makes sense and is part of the solution. But you might ask, what of our division? What of the left-right divide? It's a deeply rooted problem, far too complex and confounding to address and solve in these brief comments. But what if historic places, sites, communities, and museums use their place in history to speak to our journey as a nation? The good, the bad, the ugly, and the indifferent. And they met people across those divides that we talked about. Fortunately, we have a chance and a moment to do that, and perhaps reach some new hearts and minds in the process. And that is this major opportunity coming before us of America 250. And what a perfect place to have this conversation, because I was reading in the back here that this was one of the original bicentennial centers. And what's old is new again. 50 years later, we're staring down at another anniversary. And I know Alexandria is 275 years old, and we have this opportunity with America 250 that we as preservationists and historians can't let us pass by. It's fast approaching in 2026. I'm proud to have been appointed by Governor Westmore in Maryland to our own state's commission, which is tasked with preparing what we will consider the most inclusive commemoration of our nation's founding that's ever been attempted. And from civic engagement to understanding our Constitution, this is really the crux of bridging divides, understanding who we are and using historic places to explore those stories. All Marylanders need to see themselves reflected in history. Because seeing ourselves reflected in history truly matters, as I wrote. It also matters. And it's why Preservation Maryland recently tackled one of our most complex and complicated projects in the past 40 years, in our first property redevelopment project in the past 40 years. And that was saving this small cabin in a historic African-American community in Hagerstown, Maryland, that had been long forgotten. This structure, which you're actually seeing above, sort of the before and below the after, is in the Jonathan Street neighborhood of Hagerstown, Maryland, 417 North Jonathan Street. And this building was sort of a nondescript, small, squat, one-story structure that was hit by a police cruiser, went out of control, slammed into it, and it was destined for the landfill. Fortunately, we had a demolition crew that came in, peeled back the asbestos siding, or actually I think it was aluminum siding, and realized what they had on their hands was a log structure, and they said, maybe we shouldn't demo this thing, which is amazing, rarely happens. They actually received an award for that. And we were brought in by these two individuals, Reggie Turner on the right and Terrence Moore. This was during the pandemic, so he was masked, on the left, from the community, and they said, we think we have something really important on our hands. And we had already been talking together about buildings in this neighborhood, in this community, and one had just recently been lost. It was, they called it the Moxley Band building. It was a place where one of the oldest African-American bands in Maryland used to perform and rehearse. And we sent an engineer in, and it was just too far gone, and unfortunately it had to be demolished. And I said, well, at that moment, maybe this is the start of a conversation. Sometimes the best things come out of sort of these bad moments. And fortunately, just a few weeks later, this whole thing kind of fell into our laps. And we did some research in this project and came to find out we had our hands on one of the oldest standing structures, probably in Western Maryland. We did something called dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings. We actually took a core sample from this structure, and we did an archaeology study with the Maryland Department of Transportation, because it used to sit along the old National Road. And come to find out that the building like a lot of log structures, had been disassembled and reassembled on site in the 1830s when it was 100 years old. So this building was felled, the logs that went into this building were felled in the winter of 1739. Long before America was even a nation, this building stood. And what we learned is, as Scott will tell you as a historian, you can never say absolutely, but we believe that this was probably one of Jonathan Hager's 2 original cabins, because his family owned the outlot that it now sits on and moved it out there in the 1830s to turn it into tenant housing. And so it came within a whisper of being demolished, the home of the namesake of the community. You know, the city of Hagerstown issued the demo permit for the home probably of their founder. We know that he had 2 log cabins standing in the 1740s before he built the stone home that is today a city museum. And this research uncovered we had something much, much older on our hands than anyone expected. I couldn't believe it when we got the dendrochronology report back. I thought it was a mistake, but it was so specific. Not only did we know that those logs came down in the winter of 1739, but we knew that they came down in the Conococheague Creek watershed. That's how specific the data set has become for these tree ring data in that part of Maryland, because we have so many good samples to go by. And so we were able to rehabilitate this structure and turn it into, or I should say, keep it, housing. We went through the process of working with the community, making sure what we were doing met with the needs of that community, raised the funds, and rehabilitated this structure, and sold it for owner-occupied affordable housing. And we sold it to first-time home buyers who are now living in a piece of true American history. We placed a conservation and preservation easement on it so it can never be demolished. And in doing so, we didn't just save an important old building or even just create housing. We also showed the people of that community that their history matters. In fact, we put a sign right on the front of it during construction that said, "History happened here." And the crew that was involved in this project said to us, you know, they had been involved just recently. Prior to that, they would rehab the Washington Monument in Baltimore. They had been involved in working on Monticello. So we hired one of the best rehab crews that was out there, Worcester Eisenbrand. And they said, "We have never been stopped more on a project by passersby than we have on this little log cabin." And I said, "Well, what's the question?" And they said, they just kept saying, "I didn't know anything historic was in this neighborhood." One of the most historic neighborhoods in that city. And so we brought history to life in that community, not only in the physical structure of this building, but in the hearts and minds of the people who lived in that community. That community had value. And as a result, there was a documentary made about this some people may have seen on public television, just won a Telly Award, called The House on Jonathan Street. And then there was also an opportunity to have the governor come out and see that place. Everybody wanted to come out and get their picture taken with it once they realized what this thing was and what an important place this was. And Governor Moore was able to put this building in context, and the context of its value not only to the state of Maryland, but to the people of this community. And as a result, this has spurred further action in that community in rehab and restoration and investment. And the local historically African-American school received a huge influx of funding to be rehabbed as its community center. The pool behind it received a first of its kind grant from our state's African-American History Preservation Fund that is actually restoring the pool itself. And that will come back online as a historic pool for use this summer by the local kids in that community. And so preservation is creating not only a community center, but there will be kids splashing around this summer because of historic preservation and because of the emphasis and the focus. And Preservation Maryland is not really, at the end of the day, the reason that this succeeded. It's because there were local people who stood up, raised their hand, got involved, and we're able to draw on all these different resources to invest in a place like this. And that's because their history mattered. And you're seeing us here dedicating it with folks from the community, with the architect, with the engineer. The structure actually, for those preservation gurus in the audience that are interested in this kind of thing, the foundation for it basically had melted into the ground, and it's not really the technical term, but it just kind of sloughed into the ground over the years. And so we actually elevated the structure. We lifted it about 3 feet in the air, rebuilt a foundation underneath of it, and then gingerly set it back down. And in the process, too, where it had been hit by the police cruiser, we just brought those logs kind of back out. And we explained it's sort of like a giant version of Lincoln logs. It is almost that adaptable in that way. We also put a addition back on the back of it where one had previously stood. And so we took it from about a 700 square foot structure to about a 900 square foot structure. So it's a very cozy little house. And there's already been not only that school that I mentioned, but other series of investments up and down throughout this community, including Union Hall, which hopefully someday I'll be able to come back and tell you about, which is being tackled by community members. We believe it is one of the last remaining GAR USCT halls left in Maryland. So a Grand Army of the Republic, the veterans organization of the United States Colored Troops. There's one on the Eastern Shore, and there is one here in Hagerstown. And as a result of all this interest and attention, the organization that owns that, the Prince Hall Lodge Masons, have applied and received some initial stabilization funding to get that building stabilized and hopefully to open that building up as well. And all of this comes from the kernel of preservation. And of course, in doing so, we've added something back to the tax roll. We've saved embodied carbon. We've taken, vehicle miles traveled, all of those facts and figures, but we also saved something very important. And in doing so, gave people a reason to really be proud of their community. And I think one of the most important takeaways and lessons from this moment is that it's not the stuff, the furniture, the clapboards, or the cornices that ultimately matter. The question we should be asking is, why does this place matter? What does it tell us? What joy or fear or confusion does it spark? How does it speak to us today? What we need right now at this moment is less information and more interpretation. And that's where we, I think, succeeded, I hope succeeded with our Jonathan Street project and the projects like it that now have followed. That was the first one in 40 years, and now we probably have, I don't know, I've lost count, like 7 underway right now, all across the state with different partners. From Howard County to the city of Annapolis, to the Department of Natural Resources, to the city of Brunswick. We're working on a wide scale of different projects. All with a focus on breathing new life into these places, but not just telling the story of them, but telling why they matter. Why does it matter? What joy or fear or confusion does it spark? How does it speak to us today? What part of our story does it tell? It's something that we're really committed to, because historic places and sites need to be proactively equipped and engaged with visitors, with a deep awareness of what their site means, not just what it was. Because we'll never save places if all we talk about is what they were or the very basics of them. We have to speak at a much deeper level about these places. And I would argue that this is our charge. And I always come back to this quote as well, which is attributed to St. Augustine. I hope I got that right. Seneca or Cicero, perhaps you could tell me. That hope has 2 beautiful daughters, and their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. And if I could find a better way of summarizing what I've told you here tonight, it's that as preservationists, we need to be focused on this thought, on this charge. That we funnel our anger into courage, our anger about losing historic places, about change, and we funnel that into courage to save places and to find unique dynamic and adaptable ways to make our historic places last and continue to provide for our future. We're focused on evolving our places and finding a way to make sure that they still serve, and that we can use history to affect real change in a world that needs it so much at this moment. Thanks for joining me tonight. With any luck, that has generated some thoughts, perhaps even some contradictions, and that's okay. Yeah?
The case for preservation of buildings, especially, is really important. You made a great case. But can you help us make a distinction between preservation, which you're talking about, and conservation, and in that light, the importance of cultural landscapes?
So, yeah, it's interesting. The terminology can be tough, and like in the UK and in Europe, they talk about heritage conservation. They don't call it preservation. We use the word preservation often, and in audiences, I'll just kind of generally say preservation, because if I start getting into all the different terms and I parse words between preservation and rehabilitation and restoration and conservation and stabilization, I normally start to lose people. So I generally try and stick with one term and kind of go with it, sometimes at our own detriment. But you're right, there is a difference between conserving things and preserving things. The goal for us is never to track a building in amber. The goal is not to keep something as it was, unless you're in one of those unique cases when you're talking about a museum piece. But we support our museum colleagues and provide funding to them. We have a grant program. We do a lot of different things as an organization and care a lot about them. But when we think about community resources and allowing communities to evolve and adapt, we are kind of looking at it more from that adaptable standpoint. So I think that there is a tremendous need to invest in the adaptable reuse of buildings, and that we need to be flexible with that. And that flexibility is not just like a buzzword to throw around. A real perfect example of that is we're rehabilitating right now a structure at the water's edge in Annapolis, which I know is an issue that you deal with here in Alexandria. And flooding is a real thing. And so we're elevating the structure. I used to say raising, and that always seemed like a bad word to use because people think I'm using the R-A-Z instead of R-A-S. R-A-I-S. And so there's an example where we have to be flexible in the way that we rehabilitate and reuse a structure in light of a changing climate. And we can't just rehab this Burtis house that we're working on in Annapolis and then just let it get flooded the next day. So there does have to be a lot of understanding of that. I know that the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has recently, the chair has put out a report that suggests perhaps looking at a more graded approach to preservation in the United States, which is how the United Kingdom again does this, where they have different gradations for buildings, and which allows you to do different things and a different level of preservation and rehabilitation when it comes to different types of structures. And I think that there's a lot to be said there and something to be looked at, because I think that sometimes there is what one of my colleagues calls a culture of preciousness when it comes to historic structures, and that we treat everything as if it is, the inside of Monticello, or, just this fabulously important architectural resource. And there are different things that we should be able to do with different structures. We live in the real world. That doesn't mean that preservationists need to roll over on every issue, or that we need to weaken every resolve or every ordinance. But I do think that we have to be practical in our approach, and that is something that I know that the Advisory Council has put out this sort of conversation piece for us all to consider, and I think a lot of us are still chewing on it, and I don't know really where I fall on all that, but that is part of the conversation right now. To the point about cultural landscapes, we've been involved extensively in that. We see it is two sides of the same coin. And that probably is because in my past I worked for a land conservation group, and so I'm aware of that need. In Maryland, we have done an amazing job of investing in smart growth. In fact, the word smart growth comes from Maryland. Harris Glendenning, our governor in the 90s, was the one who coined that term. And so smart growth is now some 30 years old. We've done an amazing job of holding the line on new sprawl, and we've done that through a variety of different tools. But we could do a much better job of incentivizing infill, and that's the other side of that coin. And so if you want to save cultural landscapes, you have to be engaged in the work of infill development as well, and making the case for where new construction should go. And that's why we have a program called Smart Growth Maryland, where we are really working at the nexus of those two issues. So cultural landscapes matter, and if we care about them, we have to care about existing communities, and those being both historic, non-historic, and new communities that people want to live in. Yeah.
So kind of related to that, you talked a lot about different state and county funding and programs and grants, which are great. But what about kind of getting the private sector, who are the people who really have all the money, getting them involved in investing?
So
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure, I can repeat the question. The question is, how do we get the private sector involved in this work as well? There's a couple different things. I mean, I will say that it is like Virginia, if anybody is doing it right in terms of incentivizing the private sector to get involved in preservation, it may not be perfect, but Virginia is certainly leading the pack when it comes to state investment in incentivizing the private sector. And I say that because Virginia's state historic rehab tax credit is an uncapped 20, I think it's 20%, near 20 or 25, but it's an uncapped credit, meaning there's over like $100 million a year worth of historic tax credits going out to projects all across the Commonwealth. By comparison, and I know this number because we always throw it at our General Assembly, Maryland's credit is capped, and we only do about $20 million a year in historic tax credits. And what a historic tax credit is, for those who aren't familiar, is if you spend, we'll just say $1 million to make the numbers easy, on a historic structure in qualified rehab expenditures, then if you have a state historic tax credit, in Maryland, for example, they'll give you 20% of that million. So they'll give you $200,000 towards that project. And then the federal government, if it's a qualifying project, will also give you another 20%. So you can get up to 40% of the rehab cost paid for. And then sometimes there's a local tax credit as well, which normally comes off of your property taxes and can be extended for a certain period of time. That is the single greatest way of getting the private sector involved, and making sure that our federal historic tax credit remains and is robust is important, and making sure that in Virginia you always keep that, because that's, that is at the whim of the budget and the General Assembly to maintain such a stellar credit. Without that, the amount of rehabs would plummet, and we know that because we used to have an uncapped credit, and we lost our uncapped credit during the recession, the last one, the Great Recession, and the amount of rehabs plummeted. So it is a critical way of engaging in that work. There's a lot of other tools that exist out there as well. New market tax credits are used extensively. The low-income housing tax credit, the LIHTC, is oftentimes coupled with the historic tax credit to create affordable housing within a historic structure. There's also some work being done around greenhouse gas reduction and credits associated with basically keeping that carbon embodied in a historic structure. So the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is a part of the Inflation Reduction Act, is also a component there that is deserving of a look. So yeah, the private sector has to be involved in the process, and to the extent that preservation has been successful in the United States, it's because of that. There was a huge upswing in the number of rehabs of historic structures after the tax code changed in the late 1970s. Any questions? Yeah?
I've had the occasion to drive in Arlington recently,
Mhm.
and I see in neighborhoods that are more than 50 years old, a lot of new buildings going in,
Mhm.
where they take out one building and put in what is a larger building, but for two families.
Mhm.
And I think that some zoning changes are happening in Alexandria as well regarding that. Can you talk about this clash between the need for smart growth and more people in smaller space,
Yeah.
and the idea of keeping the historic structures for sustainability, climate, but also the character of a neighborhood?
Yeah. Well, there's always going to be friction between the need to continue to grow and our historic communities. I would argue that there doesn't always have to be that friction, because historic communities are often our densest places. They often have the highest level of density and mixed type housing. You hear this thing about like the missing middle when it comes to housing. I always joke that historic districts are the original missing middle. When they drew their little missing middle, if you ever see that little thing, it's like, oh, that looks familiar. Oh yeah, it's every historic downtown in America. Some of it has to do with, and every community is going to be different, and the local input is going to be most important to that conversation. Part of it is making sure that the preservationists are at the table to explain what value they bring and what value the existing historic built environment brings. It also sometimes has to do with things as boring but as important as mandatory parking minimums. Those are very difficult for existing communities and limit the way that infill can be done, because if you really maximize the number of parking spaces that every new structure has to have, that has to go somewhere, and oftentimes at the detriment of a historic structure. So I think that there's a lot of places actually where the development community, where the preservation community, and where planners all agree that there are certain simple things that we could do initially to reduce some of the friction and find ways to kind of get on the same page. I also think that zoning, when it comes to areas outside of our historic communities, can also become more flexible, and with things like mandatory parking minimums, and with respect to building places that people want to live in. One of the reasons you see all this traffic here, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them that you see traffic in historic neighborhoods like this is people flock to them, they love them. And we need to continue to build places that people love. And I think that the smart growth community appreciates that and understands that, and that's a great overlap between preservation and growth, in that, I spoke at a planning conference recently, and I said, if you want to build new, beautiful places that people love and want to live in, I suggest and encourage you to send your planners to your local historic district and draw up guidelines that would allow what they see. Oftentimes, our guidelines don't allow new growth to look like these places. Like, you couldn't build downtown Alexandria today on just a piece of ground somewhere. It's all non-conforming, right? Like, it's all, zero lot line, and there's no parking, and there's no setbacks, and a lot of this kind of stuff, we made communities like this almost illegal to build. And so I think some of it is we can take pressure off historic communities by continuing to build and invest in places all across our regions that people want to live in, and the kind of places that people deserve to live in. So I think we can be part of that conversation. And I think, again, it's going to be a give and take. There's no simple answer to it, but there are certain things that the preservation community can bring to the table. And there are great examples all across the country of the preservation community and the development community and the planners all kind of getting on the same page. I know that in Austin and other communities across the country, I hear from my colleagues time and time again that they're able to support some of these packages moving forward on different land use changes by finding common ground. And I do think that there's more common ground than we suspect. Yeah.
I have some tips for successful advocacy in a very historic town that is super focused on development?
Yeah. Well, the advocacy
Just in the old town.
has to be, it has to be data driven. I think our success in increasing, for example, our state historic tax credit, and a lot of the work that we do is at the state level, is focused on showing why it is a good investment for, in this case, the state to invest those dollars. That for them, it's not enough to talk about historic architecture or the feel or the authenticity. In some cases, that may matter to an elected official, but oftentimes, particularly right now, you know, in Maryland and I'm sure elsewhere, the budget is so tight and the needs are so profound that we have to show how we are a compelling piece of that economic total picture. And a lot of that has to do with having updated, compelling economic data. So we routinely and regularly update the economic data that we have available to us on the impact of, for example, of our historic tax credit. But you know, there's a firm called Place Economics that does this kind of work specifically on historic communities. And they've done stuff here in Maryland, or not here in Maryland, I keep thinking I'm in Maryland. I was let out of the state today. In Baltimore, in Cumberland, we have updated data. So that has been really important. In Cumberland, for example, you know, I think that there has been a real shift in the way that they see preservation. They used to see it as sort of an encumbrance and as a restriction, and now they're seeing it as, well, this could be an economic development tool. Now, there was a question earlier before the talk started about that and how we deal with it in Maryland, and I would say that every community is going to be different too. I think sometimes in these fast-growing communities, they are almost a victim of their own success. And you think about places like Charleston, where the pressure is intense. Savannah, again, pressure intense. New Orleans. And there, what you're really focusing in on is how can preservation, and I think the Preservation Society of Charleston is an example to look at, where they really zoned in on how they wanted to be a part of the livability conversation. And they wanted to use preservation and the tools around preservation to make sure that that community remained livable for a wide variety of people. And that is what will keep Charleston the unique, authentic place that people flock to. And I think that that's an important part of it as well. But you know, the brass tacks of advocacy is sustained early and often. You know, we don't chain ourselves to buildings, you know, not that anyone here does or suggesting that anyone would, but we are very much focused on proactive policy changes that make preservation simpler to accomplish, because we believe that if the right tools are put in place, we'll see better outcomes. And time again, we see that happening. I also think it's important that, you know, preservation groups feel like advocacy should be a priority. And sometimes that's like coming back to our roots. You know, you look back at I read there was a little article back there on the wall about how it came down to one last minute vote and there was a vote change and this building was saved. And preservationists used to be engaged in that all the time, and then there was a period of time where we didn't have to be as engaged, and we're back to that moment again. And that's okay. That's the natural evolution of a community. I think feeling comfortable doing advocacy, being engaged in it, and making a proactive and positive message and case for what you're trying to accomplish is, I think, the hallmarks of that. And I think looking at other examples around the country of people who have succeeded. You know, in Charleston, it's a never-ending thing. Those organizations are there on the ground at every Board of Architectural Review, their bar, at every meeting, watching, being involved in the process, being involved in crafting design guidelines, and being involved in the decision-making process. Because it's an iterative process. It's not a one and done, unfortunately. Yeah.
Nick, I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about how your conversations about preservation and smart growth have intersected with public transportation, especially given that so many historic communities were founded along rail lines, were founded along like light rail trolley lines, and obviously public transit can be a valuable tool for dealing with climate and for preventing road widening and stuff like that. But at the same time, when we talk about bringing rail back or expanding rail, people get concerned about what impact construction is going to have on their communities, on kind of the historic structures around. So I'd be curious if those conversations have come up and how they've been approached by your organization.
Well, they certainly come up. I mean, you know, one that we're all familiar with is like the expansion of the Beltway is, you know, an issue that's going to bump into historic resources. It comes up when we talk about the expansion of 270 in Maryland. So there is sort of road infrastructure, and then, you know, rail infrastructure comes up. We're expanding the northeast corridor underneath Baltimore and replacing a nearly, I think it's like 150-year-old tunnel underneath Baltimore. And it's going to be, the new tunnel was called the B&P Tunnel. It's going to be called the Frederick Douglass Tunnel. So there are a whole host of transportation challenges. We're also rebuilding a bridge, as many of you know, now in Baltimore as well. And so you never know when these things are going to kind of come up. I think that there's a couple things. I mean, one being not only engaged, but good partners with your colleagues in transportation planning is important. And so we have good relationships with the Maryland Department of Transportation, with the State Highway Administration. We may not always see eye to eye in every project, but we're always engaged, and they're always interested in our input on projects as a part of like the Section 106 process. I think that we also oftentimes make the argument, particularly with the historic tax credit, that historic rehabs, for example, and particularly historic rehabs for affordable housing, are better for transportation than oftentimes new affordable housing, because one of the things about new affordable housing is it's often built at the edge of a community, whereas retrofits for affordable housing of existing historic structures oftentimes happen in the heart of a community. And so we oftentimes make the case that you may create affordable housing, but it's not affordable from a transit perspective. So if you're concerned about transit, you should be really concerned about where you place affordable housing, and then it should be closest to job centers, and that oftentimes means an existing community, a legacy community. When I say historic, I'm sort of using the small h, not like a truly historic district, that's part of it, but sometimes it's just an existing community with a rhythm and feel of history and existing historic fabric. And so I think that there's no way that you can be part of the smart growth conversation without also being part of the transportation conversation, because that is part and parcel of all of it. And I think in Maryland and Virginia, we're now seeing the impact of the past 20 years worth of growth and development on transportation. Sometimes that impact comes a little bit later, and we're all feeling it now, we're all seeing it now. And so continued investment in things like mass transit and rail are an important component of that, and have to be something that we support. So, you know, we were an organization that testified in support of a study to look at mass transit into Southern Maryland, because right now people are on traffic-choked roads, and if there's going to continue to be growth, we have to figure out ways of getting people off those roads so that the communities can stay livable. So it's all part of one environmental package, which is why we invested in that program and took on the charge of smart growth as a part of the work of the organization. Yeah?
Could you say something about the symbol?
Oh, about the symbol. Yeah, that's the phoenix. So the phoenix rising from the ashes. Yeah, and it has been, it's funny, I've been with the organization now for almost 10 years. And when I first got there, I was like, I don't know if a mythological creature is really the right message. You know, like, do you think people are getting it? And then we went back and realized that we had been using the phoenix for decades and decades and decades. Preservation Maryland has been around since 1931. And so I was like, well, we're not about to change the phoenix. So the old phoenix had been redrawn so many times that we sort of joked he had kind of gotten a little bigger over the years. And so we tightened him up, slimmed him down a little bit, gave him sort of a little bit, or him or her, I don't know, a slightly more modern look to it. We had a graphic designer kind of clean it up probably 7 or 8 years ago. But we're unique in that most organizations preservation organizations have a window or a staircase or lattice or something like that. And we have a phoenix rising from the ashes. So we actually have an animated version of them as well that kind of moves.
Who did that design?
Who did this design? Well, I don't know who did the original. The oldest version we have is actually stitched onto a flag. Our organization's archives are all at the University of Maryland, so if we went way back, we probably could. I actually tried to answer this question about who did it. Maybe Scott and HAI could help us out someday, but this one was done by Younts Design, which is a Baltimore-based firm.
That's a beautiful design.
Yeah, thank you. Are you a designer?
No,
Oh.
no.
Any other questions? I feel like I'm getting the hook, so.
Well, only I saw a few people leaving,
Oh,
and
yeah.
et cetera, but it's fascinating. Thanks for all the questions and.
I'll stick around. There's more materials up here. You're
Come get
welcome
good stuff up
to
here.
get buttons and newsletters and all that kind of stuff. But thank you for having me out tonight. I appreciate it. Oh, yeah.